Across these peaceful-looking fields in August 1944, a battle raged. On one side were a group of powerful Tiger tanks, led by one of Nazi Germany's star tank aces. On the other, Canadian and British Armour concealed in ambush. Over the next few minutes, a brutal fight would unfold, which would leave 4 Tigers burning wrecks and SS-Hauptsturmfuhrer Michael Wittmann amongst the fallen. But just what happened on that day and who struck that fatal blow? Join us as we investigate the mystery and recount the action that history remembers as the Gausmesnil Tank Battle. By August 1944, the balance of power in Normandy had decisively shifted and the resurgent Allies were finally pushing the exhausted German army back into the hellscape that would become the Falaise Pocket. But that didn't mean the fighting was over, far from it. Some units still retained a strong fighting spirit and were armed with weaponry that could do real damage to the Allies. Chief amongst those were the remaining tanks of the 101st Schwer SS-Panzerabteilung. Commanding one of the battalion's companies was 30-year-old Michael Wittmann. One of the most successful tank cases of the war, he'd cut his teeth on the Eastern Front as a Stug assault gun commander before graduating to the colossal 54-ton Tiger tank in 1943. By the time he reached Normandy on the 12th of June, he was already a celebrated commander, having knocked out 117 enemy tanks and received the oak leaves to his Knight's Cross. A die-hard Nazi, but undoubtedly a talented soldier, he found himself on the 8th of August directly in the path of advancing Allied armour who had finally broken through the German lines in Operation Totalize. When, early that morning, the Allies paused to consolidate their gains and reorganise before continuing the advance, a small window of opportunity developed for a local counterattack to blunt the Allied spearhead. To be fair, this wasn't the first time Wittmann had been in such a situation. Less than 2 months earlier, he and several other Tigers had smashed into a British Armour column in the small town of Villers-Bocage, utterly wrecking an entire brigade of the famed Desert Rats in just a few minutes, for which Wittmann received massive acclaim in Germany and the swords to his Knight's Cross at the hands of Hitler personally. This time though, things would be different, as Allied armour, including veteran British and Canadian units, were lying in wait. Let's understand the battlefield. The area we're concerned with lies east and west of the modern Route Nationale 158, which ran between Caen and Falaise. The area though is significantly changed from how it looked in 1944. By overlaying this wartime aerial reconnaissance image onto the modern satellite and blending in, we see that there was a single lane highway running north-south just here, through the hamlets of La Jalousie, Gausmesnil and onto the village of Saint-Ours. A large expanse of wood and thick tree lines were found here to the northeast, and a number of smaller tracks running east-west in these locations across what were largely untouched agricultural fields. On the west side of the main road around Gausmesnil stood a large chateau bounded by trees and high perimeter stone walls which, if breached, offered good views eastwards. By blending back into the modern image, we see that the main road has expanded considerably, though the old road next to it does still exist. The wooded area to the northeast has reduced considerably, as has the once imposing chateau, and several industrial buildings have sprung up in the intervening years. Nevertheless, it was to this area that the 2nd Canadian and British 33rd Armoured Brigades had moved, thrusting southwards either side of the main road towards Falaise. They weren't to know it, but blocking their route from the south was some of the most powerful remaining German armour in Normandy. So what about the relative power of the tanks on this part of the battlefield? Well, first there was this, the Panzerkampfwagen 6 or Tiger tank. With extremely thick frontal armour of at least 100mm and reasonable side and rear armour, it was extremely hard to knock out. When combined with a powerful 88mm main gun, it packed a terrific punch, able to destroy any Allied tank or armoured vehicle on the battlefield. But it was a rare sight in Normandy, with only 150 deployed in the entire campaign. The Allies, on the other hand, fought predominantly with this, the M4 Sherman. In its traditional format, it was armed, in British and Canadian hands at least, with a 75mm dual-purpose main gun, which though effective lacked armour penetration, and so to stand a chance of knocking out a Tiger had to hit its weaker side or rear armour at perilously short range. It also suffered from a high silhouette, relatively thin armour and a disagreeable tendency to burst into flames when struck, earning it the ominous sobriquet of the Tommy Cooker. The main gun was the big issue though. It simply couldn't penetrate a Tiger's frontal armour at any real range. Though there was a solution. By pairing the Sherman with the powerful British 17-pounder quick-firing anti-tank gun and using armour-piercing discarded sabot ammunition, the Sherman Firefly, as it became known, could hit very hard, penetrating 256mm of armour at 500 metres and 233 at 1000, making it a true match for the Tiger at range. Typically in British formations, 1 in every 4 Shermans would be a Firefly variant. So, by mid-morning on the 8th of August 1944, SS-Oberführer Kurt Meyer, commanding the 12th SS Panzer Division Hitlerjugend, had arrived and surveyed the scene in front of him. Realising the perilous situation of their weak defensive line, he ordered an immediate counterattack to check the Allied advance long enough for German reserves to arrive and shore up the line. That assault formation would be Kampfgruppe Waldmüller, a mixed battle group of 500 Panzer Grenadiers, 10 tank destroyers, 20 Panzer IVs and 5s, with Wittmann and the remaining 6 Tigers of the 101st Heavy Tank Battalion leading the assault. But things got off to an ominous start, when at 12:30 as KG Waldmüller formed up, red flares burst above them, heralding the arrival of an Allied air attack, something that had long terrified German troops in Normandy. Opting to advance immediately to avoid the onslaught, engines roared to life, and at the signal, the mixed force raced headlong towards the enemy. Their target was not though these formations hidden in the orchards just here, but rather the visible Canadian armour massing here on Hill 122, the highest point along the main road. With the 7 Tigers in the lead, they pushed on at full speed across this ground, pausing in hollows to fire before continuing on with infantry in their wake. Moments later, the crash of Allied artillery struck as shells landed all around, churning the ground up and devastating the vulnerable infantry, who turned for home, leaving the Tigers unscathed, advancing alone. They didn't know it, but they were about to spring a trap. Surviving records of that action paint the picture in detail. With those Tigers advancing northwards in these locations, they were fast approaching the chateau walls on the west side of the Route Nationale. Had they stopped to look, they may well have spotted the menacing sight of gun barrels protruding through the broken brickwork, as right here were the tanks of A Squadron Sherbrooke Fusiliers. By now highly experienced and commanded by the legendary Sidney Radley Walters, the Allies' highest scoring tank ace of the war, they were in a prime position. Radley Walters had concealed his tanks, including 2 Fireflies, right here to look eastwards from behind the cover of the road. About 1100 metres away and right here to the northeast, lined up by this strip of trees, were the Sherman tanks of A Squadron of the Northamptonshire Yeomanry. Along with them, and positioned at the edge of this woodline, was No. 3 Troop, with Sergeant Doug Gordon's Sherman Firefly in the lead and 21-year-old Trooper Joe Eakins peering nervously down the 17-pounder gun sight as 3 Tigers rumbled into view. I was fortunate enough to spend an afternoon with Joe whilst working at the Imperial War Museum, and he told me a good deal about that day. But first, let's switch to the German perspective to understand what happened next. Here's Operations Officer Hauptsturmfuhrer Hans Hoflinger. Then we drove off, Michael right of the road and I left, 4 others with Michael and the brother of von Westerhagen with me. Approximately 800 metres to Michael's right, there was a small wood which struck us as suspicious and which was to prove fateful to us. Unfortunately, we couldn't keep the wood under observation on account of our mission. We drove about 1 to 1.5 kilometres and then I received another radio message from Michael, which only confirmed my suspicions about the wood. And then moments later, we began taking heavy fire from anti-tank guns, and once again Michael called, but he didn't complete the message. When I looked out, I saw that Michael's tank wasn't moving. I called him by radio but received no answer. Then my tank received a frightful blow and I had to order my crew to get out as it had already begun to burn fiercely. My crew and I dashed towards the rear and got through. I stopped to look around and to my dismay discovered that 5 of our tanks had been knocked out. The turret of Michael's tank was displaced to the right and tilted down to the front somewhat. About the same time, 12:55, as Hoflinger was racing rearward from his destroyed Tiger, another witness, SS-Hauptsturmfuhrer Dr. Raab, was witnessing events. He later wrote, There was quite heavy anti-tank and artillery fire. I wanted to get to Michael's tank. When I had got to within about 250 to 300 metres, I saw flames suddenly shoot from the tank and the turret fly off and fall to the ground. The tank then burned out completely. I still tried to reach it, but I couldn't cross the open field as the Tommy fired at solitary me with their anti-tank guns. It's unlikely that Michael got out before the hit, as I would have had to have seen him. None of the remaining crew members came back either. The attack had been stopped, with 4 Tigers, not 5 as Hofflinger said, and several other tanks destroyed in a matter of minutes, and one of Nazi Germany's most famous sons was dead. But who fired those fatal shots across these fields? It has long been debated and several claims have been made. Let's examine them in turn. First, the British claim, which centres around Sergeant Gordon's Firefly and his gunner Joe Eakins. By turning to the Yeomanry's war diary of that day, we find the following. 12:20. 3 Tiger reported moving towards A Squadron and were brewed at 12:40, 12:46 and 12:52 hours, all without loss. Interestingly, only 3 Tigers are mentioned in this entry, whereas German records report 4 were knocked out. Also, Hans Hofflinger in his account is very specific in saying, I can state the exact time of the incident. It was 12:55 hours near the Falaise-Caen road in the vicinity of Saint-Ouen. This, whilst not precisely matching, is within 3 minutes of the reported destruction of the 3rd Tiger by the Northants Yeomanry, all of which were reportedly destroyed by Joe Eakins in his Firefly. Eakins himself said the following. I could see at least 3 Tigers coming, and we had 3 Shermans and 1 Firefly. The squadron had 2 other Fireflies and I expected them to send one to help, but they decided not to and left me alone. They came across our front about 1,200 yards away, all 3 in a line with quite a space apart. We waited until they were 800 yards and our tank commander pulled us out from the orchard and told me to target the rear one. I fired twice at the 3rd tank at the rear and it blew up. We reversed so we could come out in a different place, but the 2nd Tiger fired 2 or 3 rounds and hit our turret lid. The lid must have hit the tank commander's head and he jumped out, so our troop officer took over. We pulled out again and fired at the 2nd Tiger and it exploded. We pulled back again and by this time the 3rd Tiger knew it had lost its 2 mates. I finished it off with 2 shells and had taken all 3 out in 12 minutes. Further records and images from the battlefield help us understand the situation a little better. We know that in the attack that day were 7 Tigers, 4 of which were knocked out, including Wittmann's turret number 007 on the extreme left of the 4, about 170 metres from the road. By comparing relative ranges from where we know Eakins was, we find that those first 3 Tigers were 790, 740 and 775 metres away from Eakins respectively. Wittmann, on the other hand, here, as identified on this aerial image taken the day after, was 1,000 metres from Eakins and possibly unseen. In fact, Eakins himself never mentioned a 4th Tiger, nor did he ever claim, although many others did on his behalf, to have destroyed Wittmann. By spinning around and switching to the drone, we can get an idea of Joe's view in that action. By transposing the positions identified from the aerial image onto this shot, we can clarify the situation. So Eakins and his Firefly, according to accounts, were right here. He knocked out 3 Tiger tanks moving in this direction across his half front, which, if taking the nearest 3 and in the order he described, would be here the rearmost, here and then here. With Wittmann's the 4th being the furthest away and in this precise location. Certainly within view, but maybe, given the chateau walls in his visual backdrop, lots of smoke and the circumstances during the battle, remaining unseen. So could Eakins have fired the shot that knocked out Wittmann? Yes, but it's perhaps more likely that it was the nearer 3 Tigers that he was responsible for destroying. Either way, 3 Tigers in 12 minutes is a remarkable feat. As an aside, these were the only shots Joe would ever fire in action, as he told me that considerable animosity grew between Sergeant Gordon and Eakins after the former was stunned early on and was bitter about Joe's popularity after the action, making him a radio operator thereafter. But what about the Canadian claim? We know that A Squadron's tanks, including according to Radley Walters 2 Fireflies, were in position here on that day, with gun barrels having pushed through this stone wall. He recalled the situation when returning to the battlefield in 1980. As best I can remember, I had 8 tanks left with me and 2 were equipped with 17-pounder guns. We took up defensive positions about the farm and made holes in the stone wall so we were covered from view but could observe any targets coming north on the Caen-Falaise highway and in the fields to the east of it. When we saw the German attack coming in, I just kept yelling, hold off, until they got reasonably close. We opened fire at about 500 yards. The lead tank, the one closest to the road, was knocked out. The other Tigers were engaged not only by my squadron but also by 2 Fireflies from B squadron that had moved over to La Jalousie when the counterattack started. It's my recollection that we destroyed 2 Mark IVs before the rear of the German group veered too far to the east. Again, by measuring the ground to the area in which it's believed that Wittmann's tank had been knocked out, it's somewhere in the range of 200 metres and flank on to the Canadian armour, a much closer shot. So, who was responsible for the demise of Michael Wittmann? Well, the truth is we'll never be absolutely certain, but several clues give us a much more likely answer. This single photograph, taken by a local civilian shortly after the action and showing the turret detached from the main body, does absolutely confirm that Tiger 007, Wittmann's, was on the left-hand side of the 4 destroyed Tigers. This image, though, doesn't have sufficient clarity to definitively answer the question of how it was knocked out. Clearly an explosion has detached the turret, but no damage is evident on the hull. That said, the photographer, a local farmer named Serge Varin, who took the shot 6 months later, claimed that there was explosion damage in this area on the rear left part of the hull, around the air inlet above the port fuel tank. He also found an RAF Typhoon rocket nearby, which led him to believe that Wittmann was knocked out by aerial attack. But contemporary records from RAF sources don't back this up, and the rocket may well have been fired months later, so really we can discount that. His assertion, though, that there was damage on the rear left is interesting. He claimed it was not a penetrating shell hole but rather an outward explosion. In reality, it could well have been both, but either way, it's in the approximate location you might expect a shell strike if 007 was knocked out by one of the Sherbrooke Fusiliers to its left. Wittmann's tank is though confirmed as the same one identified here in this grainy aerial image, thus closest to the Sherbrooke Fusiliers and rearmost of the 4. The other 3 identified in these locations on the aerial image are to the right, closer to Joe Eakins. We also know from Eakins' own account that the first Tiger he knocked out was the rear one, of which he said, "I fired twice at the 3rd tank at the rear and it blew up." But the timing doesn't match with the Yeomanry's War Diary, which says that the first Tiger was brewed at 12:46, not 12:55 as Hofflinger reported, nor does it match with the method of destruction, as according to Dr. Raab, Wittmann's tank only exploded several minutes later as he ran towards it. If we consider though that the rearmost Tiger Eakins saw was not Wittmann's, but instead this one, the situation makes much more sense. On balance, it's probable but not certain that Trooper Eakins destroyed all 3 of these Tiger tanks on this field near Gausmesnil in a remarkable piece of skill under fire, and that one of the Sherbrooke Fusiliers just here was responsible for the destruction of Tiger 007. What of Wittmann and his crew? Records tell us that they were buried in a hastily dug communal grave in the very field where they were killed, and there they stayed until 1983 when a search uncovered their bodies, with the crew being positively identified by the charred identity disc of Heinrich Reimers, 007's driver, and a 6.35mm pistol Wittmann habitually carried in his uniform pocket. All 5 crew are today buried in Lacombe German cemetery, alongside 21,000 fallen comrades. But perhaps the final word here should go to Joe Eakins, who told me that he never even heard the name Michael Wittmann until the 1960s, who, when I asked him shortly before his death in 2012 if he was the man responsible, simply replied, "To be honest, I don't care. All I know is that I fired 5 shots in the war and I knocked out 3 Tiger tanks. And that's enough for me." Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, why not check out our other films following the Normandy campaign right here on YouTube. And if you're interested in the history of the Second World War generally, be sure to check out World War II Both Sides of the Wire, our dedicated podcast in which our hosts, Professor Matthias Strohn and Jesse Alexander, explore all aspects of the conflict from both the Allied and Axis perspectives. That's all this time. We'll see you again soon.